Hey there, my name is Jackson Haime, or as some of you know me, Written Insanity, and welcome to Prompted, the official podcast for the writing prompts section of Reddit.com, where you are prompted to write stories, and here we showcase the best of them, all with the goal of helping each other become better writers. Thank you, recording of me, for passing the microphone to me so generously, as you are going to every single week, because I don't feel like recording that intro again. Welcome to Prompted Live. This is Jackson Haime, and I'm here to talk to you about the special 5 million subscriber contest that we had on Reddit over the past 2 months. Now, what we did is we had our subscribers write novelettes, a novelette being anything under 17,500 words that is a short story. So for the contest, we went with 7,500 to 17,500. After this, there was a voting period of all the entrants who voted for each other through rounds 1 and then round 2, and we've ended up with our top 3. So we're going to be reading the top 3 novelettes that were on the subreddit, and that is going to be our Prompted podcast today. I am super excited. All these stories are really great, and all of them definitely deserved to be at the end of this contest, and I have no idea how they wrote these in only a month. It is insane. Now, for the sake of time, we are going to be only reading one chapter at the start of each. Each one's going to be a little taste tester, that you can go read the story on your own. Sadly, we do not have time, and I don't think you do either, listener, to listen to 3 full novelettes audio. So, what we're going to do, we're going to read the first story right now. We're going to get right into it because this is going to be a long podcast no matter what I do. So here, now, is the first story, The Importance of Books. There were 3 things that Leroy Huntsman hated in this world: vegetarians, commies, and books. He liked to think that he did his best to keep all 3 out of the sleepy little town he had lived in all his life. Rabbits, as he called vegetarians, had never been popular in the first place, not in a farming community that depended on livestock for its livelihood. Commies were a little more worrisome in this day and age, where young people were rejecting all that America wanted to offer, turning to scummy filth like Europe and screeching about socialism. They'd say that's somehow different from the Reds, but Leroy couldn't bring himself to believe them. The few more outspoken young'uns had been taken care of, courtesy of his son on the police department. After all, Leroy wanted to keep his little town safe. Books had not been a problem for many years. With a community numbering under 1,000, mostly good people, it had been impossible to sustain a library. Not that Leroy minded. Yes, many years ago there had been a library of sorts, and it displeased him because the young kids would spend their summers sitting on their asses in its cool confines, leaving their parents to work the fields alone. The smug little librarian, what was her name? Meredith or something, had touted the importance of educating the children and whatnot. But Leroy knew it was an act. After all, they had school to educate the kids already, as much as they needed to know to take over their daddy's farms. No. What Meredith wanted was to use those written lies to pull apart the sanctity of their little community and watch it burn from the inside out. A few well-placed rumors were enough to ensure that Meredith's place in the town was compromised. It wasn't enough to call her a whore, of course, but Leroy knew the town's predilections and the whispers towards fucking each other was enough to ensure that the tide turned. Meredith left the town hissing and spitting, and Leroy was content once again. That all changed one quiet evening in June. Leroy was sitting in Mikey's bar, as was his wont, nursing a Budweiser and talking shit with Mikey himself. The evenings had all the trappings of a good time: the rustle of pool balls in the room to the right, little Haime Hanover sliding up to him on the left, and the buzz of cheap beer thrumming through his hard body. And then Dan walked in. Maybe stumbled was a better word for how Dan came crashing in through the door, loudly ordering a Jack Daniels that Mikey would give him, even though he shouldn't. Dan was an alright guy, except when he was drunk, which was admittedly most of the time. That's how he appeared in the appellation of Drunky Dan, though Leroy secretly preferred his name, Dumbass. "Hey, Leroy," he slurred, slumping in the seat next to him and scaring Heidi off. Leroy swore under his breath as he watched her tight little ass jiggle in those Daisy Dukes. "What brings you here, Dan?" asked Mikey with the tone of a courtesy only reserved for most troublesome customers. "Gotta talk to Leroy over here," he laughed, slinging his arm around Leroy's shoulders. "I thought you were such a big softy now, you rat bastard." Leroy could feel the tension growing in the air around him, the slight as he answered. "What the hell are you going on about, Dan?" "The library! The library!" he shrieked, devolving into giggles. Leroy gave him the patented, "What the hell is wrong with you?" glare. The old library was just across the bar, as it were. A tiny eyesore with a leaking roof and broken windows. It gave Dan a pleasant satisfaction to see it festering there, proof of the good that books could do for a community like theirs. For the most part, however, he hadn't thought about it in a long time. "And what about the library is so damn important that you have to bother me about it tonight?" he practically growled. And then Dan said something important, which he almost never did. "Didn't you hear? Soaping it up again." Leroy froze. Mikey gave a jump too, although he hit it well. Mikey had been serving Leroy for upwards of 20 years, and he knew exactly how Leroy felt about books. "That's so?" Leroy asked, keeping his tone light. "And who's opening it back up?" "New folk," said Jan, chugging his whiskey and chasing it with large gulps of air. "Animal. Out of 10. I ain't never seen someone so strange in my whole life, Leroy." Leroy gave a noncommittal as he went back to his beer, pointedly ignoring the random drunk falling part in his seat next to him. He wanted to sigh, given the massive irritation that had just come crawling back to his life. That damn library. Instead, he brushed it off, saving it in a corner of his mind to look at again tomorrow. After all, he'd shut it down once. He'd certainly do it again. It was only a few weeks later that Leroy practically stalked into the newly opened library, wondering how long it would take to run this stranger out of town. He stopped in his tracks just inside the front door, his mouth gaping as he took in the building's sudden, baffling transformation. Shiny new hardwood floors had graced the little library, visible between the rows of brand new books. There seemed to be more shelves than possible considering the size of the building, but the space wasn't cramped or messy. It was impeccably tidy, its uniformity only broke by the little circle of reading chairs in the center of the space. There was no sign of the years of water damage, mold, sludge, slime, decay that had graced the library just a week or so earlier. Now, Leroy didn't like libraries, or librarians, or strangers. But damn if he didn't appreciate a job well done. His stride relaxed a bit as he walked past the rows of books and chairs and arrived at the front desks, an odd name for a space seated at the back of the building. He waited for a moment behind the heavy mahogany desk, waiting for the presumptuous librarian to appear. When nobody arrived to greet him, he rang the bell impatiently. "Just a minute," a voice called amid one of the towering stacks of books. Leroy grumbled to himself a little. If you're going to run a library, aren't you supposed to deal with the patrons first and foremost? As he looked around, taking another moment to really appreciate how much work had gone into this library. A shame he was going to ruin it. He was going to tear the goddamn thing down this time if that's what it took. Just as he had this thought, from out of the shadows of the books came a tall, thin man with black hair pulled down to a little bun on top of his head. He had an angular face and deep-set brown eyes. There didn't seem to be a speck of muscle on his body, and Leroy frowned. This certainly wasn't a man who had spent his days outside or in the fields. He looked as if a gust of wind might blow him over and crack him in two. It was disgusting. But the way the man smiled at him, full of cordiality and brightness that didn't seem to match his austere posture, suddenly endeared Leroy to him. That only served to make him more irritable. Clenching down in his anger through years of practice, Leroy made his move. "It is quite some change, isn't it? You've managed to rebuild this place from the inside out." The man nodded as he settled himself behind the desk. He pulled a card out from one of the drawers and gave Leroy a knowing glance before saying, "You must be Leroy Huntsman." Leroy froze a little before growling. "How did you know?" "One hears things. Specifically, I heard you might be coming in to see me," said the man, and Leroy felt all traces of the reluctant friendliness that had besieged him vanish. "My name is Stanley Crut. As you can see, I'm the town's new librarian." If Leroy hadn't known any better, he'd think Stanley was laughing at him. There was something about his countenance, a hint of smugness that he couldn't quite pinpoint. He didn't like it. "And you think that our town needs a library, Mr. Crunt?" he asked, not even bothering to hide the nastiest in his voice. "Every town needs a library, Mr. Huntsman," came the reply, placid and pleasant. "Now I think I know why you've come today." Leroy was about to give Crut his candid opinion on books and newcomers, and smugness when the library pulled out a book and handed it out to him. "I've already checked it out under your name. Here, take this too." He handed Leroy the card he'd pulled out earlier, and Leroy realized it was a library card, bearing his name and address. His temper flared at the man's presumption. "And what the hell am I supposed to do with that?" Leroy asked in utmost irritation, looking at the book as though it were a twitching, lurching spider. There was disgust in that look, mixed with a bit of fear. "Like I said, Mr. Huntsman, I know why you've come in today. Don't you agree it's important to know one's enemy?" Crut's face took on a distinctly frigid look as he continued to hold out the book, and Leroy understood that this was a challenge. He was never one to back down to a challenge. "I'll be back," he snapped as he yanked the book from the man's hand, purposely dropping the library card on the floor. He stomped out of the building. If he'd looked behind him, he would have seen increase in smugness on Crut's face. As it was, he was simply too enraged to think about anything else than bringing the book home and burning it, out of spite. That night, Leroy sat in his little house just off of Main Street, staring at the green-covered book in his hand and chasing his distaste with whiskey. He didn't really like spending his nights in the lonely house. It was little more than a shack, really, a one-floor mess that let in all the cold drafts nothing could chase away. After his wife had died, he couldn't take care of the farm on his own anymore, so he'd moved here to spend his retirement guarding over the community. His community. And reminiscing. Well, maybe not so much that last part. He didn't really like spending too much time thinking about the past. His fingers stroked over the book, grudgingly enjoying the rough material against his skin. Leroy House had no place for books, the damn things, but he couldn't help but be intrigued by this one. He found himself wondering why Crut had given it to him, how he knew he'd be stopping by. He considered for a moment burning the book then and there, ridding himself of what was sure to be a nuisance. After all, his father had often told him that little knowledge was a dangerous thing, and well, what were books but little collections of knowledge? Even as he had these thoughts, his fingers moved to open the book. Just a peek. What could it hurt? His eyes skimmed the cover page and he let out a low gasp. It was his name. There was no author, no publisher, nothing else but his monk here spread out across in large, black letters. Spellbound, he turned the page with trembling fingers. And what greeted him was his life story. He read slowly at first. He'd always been a slow reader, having a difficult time finding his way through the forest of words on the page, but his pace quickened as his memory slipped into the details. He was born in 1950 in a sturdy old farmhouse just a few miles outside of town. His mother died in childbirth. He helped his father in the fields from a young age. His older sister helped too, until she fell in the pig pen and became permanently disabled. Her father neglected her for years and eventually sent her off to live in some state-run institution. Leroy hadn't seen her since. He kept turning the pages. He read about his most memorable experience with his father's television set, watching the first manned space flight in 1961. The way he'd been entranced by astronauts, the way he'd always wanted to be one. Until years later, his eyes darkened as the words took him back to the night his father had beaten his fantasies right out of his skin. "Ain't no use in you continuing school," Alan Huntsman said, his breath perfumed with liquor and cheap cigarettes. "I need you in the fields." "But Dad, Miss Silver said if I want to be an astronaut, I gotta graduate from high school first," Leroy pleaded. Miss Sylvia was his favorite teacher, and the only person who ever laughed at his one ambition. Quick as a snake, his father's left hand darted out and left a print on the side of his face. "You dumb little shit," he hissed. "How the hell are you gonna do that? You think you're going to college? That money grows on trees? Listen here, your father's a farmer, your granddaddy was a farmer, you were born a farm boy, and by God, you're gonna die a farm boy. Anyone who tells you anything else is filling your head with nonsense, and I'll have none of that, you hear?" Anger rose in Leroy's throat as his father dismissed his dreams. "You can't tell me what to do with my life," he shouted, daring for the first time in many years to raise his voice. After all, this was dreadfully important to Leroy, and it hurt him that his father couldn't understand. "What did you just say to me?" His father's voice had gone deathly quiet. This moment Leroy had shown signs of talking back. Before the boy could answer, his father's fist connected with his face, breaking his nose, which would be permanently crooked after it healed. "I'll teach you what happens to farm boys who don't learn their pace," he growled, as his fist shot out over and over, reducing Leroy to a bloody mess of bruises. Leroy only had one thought in his mind. This isn't worth it. Something broke inside the boy that night. The bruises and broken bones healed eventually, but Leroy never dreamed again. For the second time that week, Leroy stalked into the little library that he was determined to destroy. His war against Crut was, however, currently postponed. The librarian was sitting at his desk, scanning books into the system, when Leroy dropped the green book on the mahogany desktop and hissed, "Where's the rest?" Crut smiled as though he'd been expecting this, and the thought made Leroy grind his teeth in irritation. He read every word in that book. He read it once, and then twice, and then again and again, until night gave way to dawn. Every inch of his life, every important moment was cataloged with profound intimacy. It was, in fact, cataloged right up to the point they'd run that stupid bitch, Meredith, out of town. And then the words just stopped. There was no ending, no resolution, only blank pages that he was sure deserved writing. So where was it? "You sure you know the answer to that one, Mr. Huntsman?" Crut said with ease while returning to stack his books. "Your story is already ended. There's nothing left." "There wasn't an ending," Leroy said with great indignation. "I'm still alive, aren't I?" "No, actually, you're not." Crut's eyes were cold again, so cold that they made the tips of Leroy's nerves shiver. Leroy fell silent as he continued. "It must have hurt you, didn't it? When your father smashed your dreams, dropped to the ground, and you watched them shatter? I'm sure it did. Perhaps you think he gave you excuse for what you did." "What did I do?" Leroy asked, confused. "There were so many chances to rebuild yourself," Crut continued, his fingers running along the spine of Leroy's book. "You were in your father's clutches forever. You could have become anything you wanted, even an astronaut." Leroy began to shake. How could this man know so much about his life, so much that he had buried inside? "But you didn't do that, did you, Leroy? You destroyed your own dreams, and then you decided to destroy everybody else's." Crut's voice took on a scornful edge as he said, "You sealed your fate when you crushed the library. This little library, in fact, the librarian that you ran out of town, could have given you so many other people hope. Could have given you the tools to rebuild those dreams that you left in the dust. Instead, you called her a whore. A woman-fucking whore." That's where your story ended, Leroy. Any chance you had at a life was destroyed the moment you deprived this town of this one source of knowledge, adventure, possibility. You are the responsible for the failure of so many dreams. And now, there's nothing left for you to do but drink, sleep, and waste your life away. You got exactly what you wanted. You should be happy. Leroy stood stock still, staring first at Crut, and then at nothingness as the words seeped into his brain. He thought back to the day he'd let his father strangle his dream. The day he decided his ambition wasn't worth it. For the first time in his life, he thought back to all the other dreams he'd crushed. Other people's dreams he had no business touching. The guilt was insurmountable as he thought of what he'd learned from his father and how he'd inflicted on so many others. "So what do I do now?" he asked, mostly to himself. Crut shrugged. "It doesn't matter. Can it be changed? It's already been written." Leroy's face returned to a soldier shell-shocked, and he turned to stumble out of the library, his lungs clamoring for air they could never quite reach. Leroy unplugged his phone from the wall that night. Not that anybody called him anyway. Still, It seemed like the right thing to do. He sat in his favorite chair, the one his father had once sat in, and poured himself a whiskey, and then another, and another. He thought about what he'd done with his life. Really thought. He considered then what he hadn't done, what he wished he'd done. It wasn't enough. He was hardly surprised when he reached for it. Hidden under the table drawer, turning over in his hands, the warmed metal against his skin. He was drunk, but not drunk enough to regret what he was going to do. He brought it to his head as one thought rang out in his mind. A doctor. My son told me he wanted to be a doctor. The sound of a gunshot was swallowed up in the sounds of the night. Well, that's one way to end chapter 1. That was the first chapter of The Importance of Books. The second chapter is called Heidi Hanover, jumps to a different character as something unfortunate happened to our narrator. Now, that was one of the top 3 in the Novelette contest, as I mentioned before, and because we are going to have a rather long episode today, no matter what, I'm going to jump straight into our next one, which is called Holly Went for a Walk. Hector buzzed Holly again, getting so close that she reflectively swatted at his floating basketball body. "What do you want?" she asked, removing her earbuds.
"You should not be here,"
said the small robot.
"Please go back home, Holly."
"Why?" she asked. "It's just a forest."
"It's dangerous,"
followed by a low electronic moan.
"There are wild animals out here and no safety, robots."
Holly pressed through a low-hanging branch that had grown through the old footpath. She felt the rough bark as it snapped back, and her hand came away with a handful of smooth, green leaves. There were small holes chewed into them, and the edges were getting brown, evidence of insects, of nature, real nature. Tiny autonomous landscaping drones guarded the trees in her local park day and night, swarming any intruding pests they weren't shooting on the grass to keep it even. No leaf ever hit the ground. Cresting a small ridge in the path, Holly squinted and raised a hand against the shaft of sunlight piercing the canopy. It was morning, and her entire body ached with the hike. A yawn overtook her, stiffening her back as she stretched out. Once clear of the glare, the overcoming terrain revealed itself. The path kept winding downward, toward a wide gully that cut across the forest at an angle. She consulted the map she'd drawn and traced a thin blue line with her finger. Looked like she was going the right way. A few motions on her PDA and she could have found accurate maps of the forests, and her GPS locator to guide her in real time. That would all be monitored, so she left it behind, resting on the bench with a note for her mother. By now, someone would have reported it. She didn't miss the thing, except for the journal. After years of entries that read, "Nothing happened today," there was finally something to write about.
"Where are you going?"
Hector asked. Holly didn't answer. After folding it carefully, Holly put the map back in her pocket, then pulled an energy bar from her backpack. It wasn't a particularly cold day, but she was glad of her decision to wear her heavier autumn jacket. She pulled the hood over her head and replaced her earbuds as she ate and walked. There was a smell of clean water near the creek in the gully, and she breathed it in deep. Cold stone and moss over pine needles. With her hands shoved into her jacket pockets, Holly crossed the water, hopping from rock to rock. Once she almost tripped, but Hector was at her back, pushing to steady her. She scowled and shouldered him away. There were small fish starting between the rocks, dull and then shimmering silver traces where the sun got their scales. On the other shore, while looking for the continuing path, she stepped onto a low bush and heard a loud, high-pitched wailing over her music. It sounded almost like a child in pain. She recoiled from the bush, stumbling and falling onto the ground as her earbuds came out and the music stopped. The screen cut off, and a moment later, a small brown rabbit darted out from under the bush, its black eyes fixed on her in a single knowing moment. And then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Slowly, Holly climbed to her feet. Her heart was racing, and she was gasping for air. She could feel the tears waiting to get out, but she forced them back.
"Are you hurt?"
asked Hector as he moved around her. "No," said Holly, brushing the dirt and fallen leaves from her clothes.
"You seem unwell,"
he said.
"You should go back home."
I must have stepped on it, she said. I'm fine. It's just a rabbit. And she started walking again.
Ma'am,
The Buxy robot, its service hatches resolutely shut.
your order exceeds your allotted calorie limit. Please change it.
Holly's mother glared at the robot, her knuckles turning white with the grip she had on the edge of the plastic table. I've added to my exercise regimen, she said, her words tight and strained. Helen, said Holly's father, the kids are hungry. Can you just leave it? No. The argument went on for a few minutes, ending only when the service robot informed Holly's mother that it had full access to their home's monitoring devices and could play back the feed of her sleeping during her alleged early morning yoga sessions. After that, the robot gave them their food, still warm from its internal trays, and Holly's father set about the task of worming his way into his wife's sudden silence. Holly had spent the morning following her mother from shop to shop, trying on new clothes for the upcoming school year. She was 10 years old now, and double digits meant double the responsibility. Or so she'd been told. And now she had a budget to manage. This was gal time as well, a chance for her and her mother to hang out while her older brother, Nate, and her father were off having their own guy time. Yet, the entire morning had been a series of brittle silences, her mother unable to stop pacing and barely responding to Holly's choices or questions. Even before they'd met up back in the cavernous, noisy food court for lunch, Holly had made up her mind. If nobody wanted to talk to her, then she might as well be alone. Nate, sitting across from her, nudged Holly with a foot and cocked his head, prompting her to lean down and look underneath the cable. He opened a bag wide enough to show her a copy of a new video game, and the big red "Restricted" label on it. How? She mouthed at him. He might be a few years her senior, but he still wasn't old enough to legally buy such a game. Nate grinned and shrugged in the direction of her father. That wasn't fair. Nate has a game he's not allowed to have, Holly told her mother, who held up one hand while she frowned at the leafy salad the robot had left her. With a heavy sigh, her mother lifted her head enough to look from Holly to Nate, and then back. Her eyes narrowed. Before she could speak, their father interrupted. I bought it for him, Holly, he said. I'll let you play it too, said Nate. Just don't tell. I asked for that game, said Holly, her voice beginning to rise. You said I wasn't old enough. Why does he get it? Holly, her mother said, her tone making the words a warning. Eat. Lunch proceeded under the clicking sound of tension, under which none of them dared speak, least of all Holly, who kept her eyes on her food while she thought of all the places she'd rather be. Afterwards, they split up again. While her mother tried on a new skirt in an overlit changing room, Holly walked away from browsing shirts and left the store. She'd wanted to find Nate first, but soon gave up on that and wandered towards the video game store. Patrolling safety robots might have found a lone girl walking the mall anomalous, so Holly did the best she could to tag along with other families when one was in sight. As long as they were going in direction. She got some funny looks, but nobody tried to stop her. It wasn't illegal, and there was no danger to anyone else, so why bother? The bored-looking young woman raised an eyebrow as Holly approached the counter, her copy of the restricted game held up like a trophy. Who's that for? Asked the cashier. Me, Holly said. I have the money. She put her debit card next to the game. She knew she had enough left from her clothes budget to afford it. I bet, said the woman. She looked across the counter and spoke softly to Holly. Look around, kid, she said. If you're up to me, I'd let you have it. But I'm the last human working in the store, the last non-robot on this entire floor. I sell you an illegal game, and it's all over for me. She glanced over her shoulder towards one of the cameras. Sorry, she said, snatching the game away from Holly. Holly had finished crying when they found her. The cashier called in the name of the debit card after Holly ran away. The safety robots tracked her down at a department store, where she hid in a rack of soft blue sweatshirts. Her father pulled her out and then bought her ice cream. He didn't ask her why she was so upset. A landscape of feathered greens and smudged browns lay before her like a painting, and it beguiled Holly even as she huddled under a towering pine tree shelter from the cold rain and hugged her legs close to preserve the warmth she could. She turned her music off and listened only to the rhythmic impact of the raindrops all around, uncontrolled, unshaped, and conforming to no meter or time scale, no convention or purpose, but still beautiful in its own way. Her breath was coming out in puffs of steam, and she remembered the time she was entering middle school and her mother had taken those 2 weeks off of work. Every day she had an elaborate breakfast ready for them when they got up. Crakes, waffles, real bacon and eggs, something different every morning. Nate and her father raved about it, but Holly wasn't a morning person at the best of times and wasn't in the mood for waking up an hour early, not when she was still mad at her mother. It was an argument about her vintage James Dean poster, the one with him sitting casually on his motorcycle, a cigarette dangling suggestively from his lips. Holly had rescued it from an estate sale. Smoking was illegal, and she'd never seen a real cigarette outside of old media. The only motorcycles around were still in museums. Holly hid it under her mattress when her mother invaded, shouting at her and wanting to tear the poster to pieces. They stopped talking after that. The end of that first week, with Holly only rolling out of bed in time to get dressed for school and grab a handful of something cold from her plate while running out the door, her mother had entered the room and sat next to her on the bed. It was a Sunday morning, and Holly had been awake for hours. "Will you come eat with us?" asked her mother. Without moving, Holly grunted. "You really should, Holly." She felt a warm hand caressing her back. "You can't stay alone in here forever." She lay still, silent, until her mother left the room. Would things be different now if she hadn't been so petty? If she had the discipline to wake up early and eat breakfast with her family? She did manage it, eventually. She ate a cheesy omelet while her father talked to Nate about sports, and her mother took tiny bites that she chewed too much. It was warmer in the house than out here. But those mornings had the same feeling of grayscale life as the forest when the first staccato raindrops sent her to the tree. On Hector's nagging insistence, his warnings about how her creek could expand and flood in a storm, she'd pushed for higher ground, and was feeling the effort of trudging through the new mud. So she retreated to the densest-looking branches she saw once she reached the top of the nearest hill. A driving wind forced her into the thick trunk to keep out of the rain. And after clearing away many of the needles of the pine cones that she could, she'd managed a nap.
"The rain has stopped,"
said Hector, his voice modulated to nearly a whisper. Holly opened her eyes and found the forest reborn. Vital greens renewed by the water and the noonday sun. After loosening her stiff legs, she climbed to her feet and walked awkwardly toward the gully, only to change her mind and keep to the high road. She wanted to see this. Nature in the raw.
"Isn't it beautiful?"
asked Hector at a normal volume. He'd taken to hovering at her shoulder, but only speaking when she wasn't listening to music. Somewhere, someone might have been trying to track him, but Holly had dug out his GPS transponder before sending off. It was that or leave him behind, so he had helped her do it. "Yes," she said, her voice creaky from sleep. She took out one of her water bottles and drank most of it.
"You should go home now,"
Hector said. "I'm not going home," Holly told him. Again.
"Why?"
Holly glared back at him for a second before deliberately putting her earbuds in. Hector bobbed up and down slightly but said nothing, trying to figure her out. He had detailed files in human psychology, as he told her more than once. Everything he did for a reason. And Holly didn't know what he was thinking, and what those reasons really were, or if he thought at all, but as long as he didn't get in her way, she could ignore him. As evening came, Holly noticed a long strand of black smoke unfurling into the darkened sky. She looked at her map, which wasn't made of any sort of scale in mind. She didn't know what landmarks to look for other than the creek. That had to be her destination, though. A rush of energy quickened her pace. That right there was Holly Went for a Walk. The first three separated parts. Holly Went for a Walk wasn't in solid chapters, so I was trying to ballpark it to a semi-similar length, but the next part is pretty long, and I didn't want to go too much overtime because we're already going to be pushing an hour, unless I'm super careful with this for the podcast. So that's the first 3 parts. I wanted to end on a good point. If it's a great point to leave it. Leaves the mystery up. Holly Went for a Walk is a great little sci-fi story. As you see, it's a humanistic story that doesn't focus on the sci-fi elements, which you don't see a lot because you see a lot of science fantasy these days, or the super hard science fiction that tries to explain anything. Holly Went for a Walk. I don't want to play favorites, but I'm a science fiction author at heart, so that's my choice for the Novelette contest. Not that I entered it, but it's my personal favorite this week. I absolutely love that story. Nice little thing. I recommend everyone goes to read it. If you don't know where to grab that, you can grab it from our contest thread on reddit.com/writing prompts. If you're listening to this podcast a little later, the quickest way to find that is going to be in the show notes. We'll make sure to link that.
Next, I'll read a portion of Burning Beethoven by user Machina M. Beethoven is good for setting fires. Piano Sonata No. 23 blared from Posey Sato's headphones as the blaze engulfed the first piece of sheet music. It burned in cadence with the song filling her ears in chopping, startling, sizzling 16th notes. Flames licked the edges in an up and down arpeggios. Tendrils of smoke curled seductively, brooding like a low F, saturating the crisp night air. As the fingers on Posey's right hand began to twitch, remembering old keystrokes, the paper grew too hot to hold. With a sharp intake of breath, Posey jerked away, releasing the smoldering remains. For a moment, the scraps of paper danced precariously above the peaks of the flames before suddenly vanishing, eaten by the inferno. Posey captured a glimpse of the composition's title in the seconds before it vanished. She wished she hadn't. It was the first piece she'd ever competed with, Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, also called Moonlight. Posey had been 11, and the sky was the dull white-gray color of eggshells. Unfortunately, so was her dress. Her mother bought it weeks before the competition. Posey detested it. It was shapeless, dull, and hung from her shoulders like a sack. But her mother had flushed with joy at the sight of it, proclaiming that it brought out her natural beauty, and Posey hadn't been able to deny her. The cashier was a middle-aged woman whose lavender-scented perfume was so strong that its odor was nearly offensive. She asked what country Posey had been adopted from. "My husband is Japanese," her mother corrected softly but curtly, "and Posey is my daughter." After, they got bubblegum ice cream. Bubblegum was the only flavor Posey would eat. That day, Posey's mother held her hand all the way home. "You should practice in your dress from now on," Posey's mother instructed eagerly when they arrived back at the apartment. "That way, the music will soak in." Posey's father was her piano teacher. He had come to America in his late 20s to work as a professor of music theory at a liberal arts college. He never once mentioned his family back in Japan, and Posey's mother had once carefully told her not to ask him about his home country. He was punctual. He left for work every day at exactly 7 in the morning and arrived home at 5:30 on the dot. He ate the dinner Posey's mother cooked, and then he and Posey worked on the electric keyboard in the living room. Sometimes they only played for a few minutes, but more often Posey's lessons went late into the hours of the night. He was a man who rarely talked. Posey used to believe that the piano had stolen his voice, and that his fingers spoke the language of music instead. But as she grew older, she realized the truth. His voice was clear and high, and had not been meant for English. Though he had learned the language and used it at work, when he was at home, he almost never spoke. When he did speak aloud, his voice was heavily accented and timid. But when his fingers touched the piano keys, the music flowed fearlessly, bold and bright. After school, Posey came home and practiced, and the dress chafed her skin. It cut into the sides of her neck and dug into her armpits. At first, it was all she could do not to rip it off, but her mother loved it, and Posey loved her mother. So she endured its sharp edges and angry, rough fabric until she no longer noticed her discomfort. Posey's father was at work the day of the competition. Her mother kissed her on both cheeks. "This one is from me, and this one is from him," she explained before sending Posey backstage to wait with the other competitors. The boys were clad in suits cut with sharp angles and stiff shoulder pads. They were marked by shiny black shoes and hair gelled down to hide rebellious cowlicks. The girls swapped themselves in excitement. Royal purples, brash reds, and exotic greens steeped in glitter and sparkles clung to their forms. Like exotic birds, they traveled in flocks. They squawked, twirled, and displayed their colors with pride, heads bobbing in unison. Their costumes, dazzling and hypnotic, overshadowed her wretched white dress. She watched them titter and giggle as she passed, her plain black shoes tapping the ground. She met none of their eyes, and was filled to the brim with embarrassment. This was how she felt at school, outcast and alone. In class, she harbored in her heart the secret that, because of the piano, she was better. But now these girls had stolen her secret and touched its keys with their own hands. Here, Posey wasn't special. She was one of many, and it frightened her. There were 49 contestants. Posey was the 11th to perform. She waited in the hallway, sitting up against the cinder block wall with her knees curled up to her chest. On the ground, her fingers drummed the first movement of Moonlight. It was more than an hour before a man with a clipboard she didn't know called her name, announcing it was her turn. She stood, brushed off her bottom, and fingers still twitching, followed him. "Good luck," he whispered as they approached the stage, and Posey, dumbstruck, nodded back. Then she turned and walked out into the light. She was instantly swallowed by brightness and empty space, and she felt smaller than she had ever had before. She turned her head towards the crowd but saw nothing. The lights glaring in her eyes were like a wall separating her from the spectators. This was nothing like the gentle blonde sunlight that filtered through her windows at home. These lights beat down on her with aggression. Somehow, it felt as if they were weighing her down. "Go to the piano," her mind commanded her. It was a grand piano, black and sleek and as big as a car, and Posey was both enthralled by and terrified by it. She had never played on a monster so large before. Bow to the audience. She did, her hands and fists at her side, fingernails digging into her palms. Sit down. Posey sat on the piano bench and smoothed her hands on the leather seat. Play, she thought, but she could not.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my microphone. In case you didn't notice, that wasn't me reading Burning Beethoven, it was Squee. I didn't trust myself with all the music terms, so I passed it on to a music major. We're already out of time for our show today. Check out the subreddit to see the winners of the Novelette contest in the correct order and give them praise. We're going to keep the same prompt over at reddit.com/prompted to give you guys some more time for responses. And remember that all of the prompts we have over there are from Ryan Kinder's 1000 Awesome Writing Prompts. If you want to support the podcast, go to reddit.com/prompted, the official subreddit of the official podcast of writing prompts. If you really want to support us, rate us on iTunes and get us that sweet, sweet 5 stars. It's what helps the podcast grow outside of the subreddit. Thanks, everyone. I'm sorry for cutting this exit short. I've been Jackson, and you should be writing. Quick question before we start. Holly went for a walk. Should I be doing voices for the robots? Because I feel like they should be like electronic than my voice is. Because I have a pretty good microphone. I'll just like do it through a really bad microphone, make it all distorted. I don't know, Keon, that's up to you. You edit and post. This is going to be Holly went for a walk, everyone.